Dr. Isaiah Helekunihi Walker is from the Big Island of Hawaii. Went to Hilo High School, came to BYU Hawaii for his undergraduate, went to UH Manoa for his master's, and then University of California, Santa Barbara for his PhD. Is an excellent surfer and had opportunities to pursue surfing as a profession, but was called in a different direction. Has published many articles and book chapters on the history of surfing, among other topics. His book, Waves of Resistance, came out a few years ago. You can also see Dr. Walker anytime there's a documentary about surfing. He's going to be one of the people that they interview. You can also catch him on the Outdoor Boys YouTube channel. Multiple millions of views when he did a traditional Hawaiian umu for them in one of those episodes. It's a outdoor YouTube Alaska guy. But anyway, we're so glad, and before we get started, I thought we would just raffle off one of his books to whoever, and this is going to be speed. Let's see, Marnie, you help me find out who's going to put their hand up first, okay? I'm going to put this on Marnie. Oh, we got preemptors. All right. Who knows? She wins. Who knows Dr. Walker's favorite food in Hawaii?
Indian food. He raised his hand if that was the thing. There was a good response.
Foodland poke.
Oh, well, poke is the answer.
All right, we're going to give that to him. Good enough. But anyway, we could go on and on, but let's give Dr. Walker a hand.
All right. Aloha. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate you being here. And also for those that have brought me over, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at BYU and to share time and space with you. So today I'm going to be talking about surfing, and really what I did with my work is kind of pulled the wool over people's eyes, because people, of course, we already had people who wanted one of my books, and because it's in some ways a little misleading, because people may think they're only going to be learning about surfing, but truly what I was doing was telling a history of Hawaii and also the United States. Stories of colonialism and identity, masculinity, and a variety of other academic themes. And surfing is really the thread or the hook to get people interested in that. Technically, I'm not a surfing historian. Such a thing may or may not exist within academia, but I was trained as an Americanist, and so I'm going to be sharing with you a bit about surfing, but mostly about people. So talk a little bit about the process. I thought maybe this would be helpful for those budding scholars who are burgeoning in your field, and maybe you're in graduate school or you're thinking of pursuing a career within academia. I want to share some of my personal experiences that may or may not be of value to you. My personal journey, as Jeff introduced, that surfing was a passion of mine from when I was really young. Some of that had to do with my parents were divorced when I was really young, and I've experienced, as many families in Hawaii do, some life struggles with family life. And the ocean, since I was really young, became a kind of what we call in Hawaii a pu'uhonua, or a kind of a sanctuary, a place of refuge. And so I think a lot of that is reflected in some of the arguments of my book. I talk a lot about how for Native peoples in Hawaii in particular, that the ocean becomes a space where they could exist, where they could form identity, in contrast to some of the things that were happening on land. A lot of Hawaii's stories, especially in the 20th century and even in the 19th century, is a story of marginalization, and the ocean provides a counter narrative to that story. So I think that a lot of that is based on personal experiences that I had, where the ocean was a place of healing, a place where I could be in touch with my kupuna, our ancestors. And that's a real experience, especially for Native Hawaiians, since surfing was a practice, a cultural practice, and a sport that was invented hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And so that identity and that ability to find a bit of who you are in that space is important. And it was important to me, but also important to the individuals that I interviewed and also read about and studied. Having a vision for your project is important. So just because I loved surfing and I eventually took that into my professional interests in graduate school, and even here, actually, I wrote one of the first versions of this as a student here in the history department at BYU. I did graduate from BYU Hawaii, but I was chasing my now wife, who was at school here, and so I was forced to come here for 2 semesters till we got married, and then we all went home. But yeah, having vision for what you're doing is important, and validating that vision with historical research, grounded historical research, primary sources, and taking a topic, because this topic is a very unconventional type of project that I had to defend quite regularly, and in many ways still have to defend quite regularly. In fact, real quick, I want to be mindful of time, but this story just came to my mind. I had sort of a run-in with the chair of the history department at University of Hawaii, where basically I don't think he saw the value of what I was trying to do. And so I ended up going elsewhere, which turned out to be a really big blessing. I went to University of California in Santa Barbara, and worked under an advisor named Paul Spickard, who was very supportive of what I was doing. Years later, fast forward, our books, his book and my book, were up for an award, a prize for author from Hawaii that does history. And when I accepted the award, and he was sitting right there, I kind of just like smiling a lot on the inside and holding that book. So I guess what I'm saying is finding a support system is important, but you have to validate that with legitimate scholarship, especially when you have a topic that seems pretty unconventional that people would question and wonder if it's something genuine. And another thing that's important when telling other people's stories is recognizing your kuleana in Hawaiian, which means your stewardship, to representing those people. I typically don't get nervous speaking in front of a crowd. And I spoke at a devotional at BYU Hawaii a couple of weeks ago, and I wasn't nervous, but most of my talk was looking at the life of Joseph F. Smith and his experience in Hawaii. And there was a moment where I realized, like, I had a kuleana to represent this individual that I was talking about, who, maybe was there at the time, and I wanted to make sure that I was representing those voices properly. So take that serious in academia. When you have a trust and you're representing other people and their voices, whether they're alive or not, there is kuleana to that. So I take that serious, and that's something that I try to do as best as possible. Context to this story of waves of resistance. Kapuina Nalu is a Hawaiian term referring to this space where the surfers enjoy the ocean. In Hawaiian, there's many different words for ocean depending on the conditions, the location of it. Moana, you've probably heard of that movie. Moana is actually like the deep ocean, the vast exploring ocean out in the deep. Poina Nalu is the breaking, and Nalu is wave. So it's the point where today surfers call it the lineup, where you sit and you catch that wave as it first breaks. So it constitutes a Native Hawaiian realm, often overlooked. It's a space that's extremely significant to Native Hawaiians, and I knew that from personal experience and growing up in the ocean and having many friends and who in Hawaii, especially growing up in the Big Island, where most of the surfers in my home community were Native Hawaiians, and which is quite different from, I think, the popular image of most surfers is sort of a Malibu kind of a perspective, but for me, that experience was very much so grounded in Hawaii. And so I realized that this was a very important space, and I was intrigued by it and wanted to kind of study more of these kind of social dynamics and questions of identity and other types of things. Also learned through this that perspective is very important. So observing history, there's a quote, observing history from the vantage of the ocean, issues of colonialism, politics, and resistance appear strikingly different. That's what also intrigued me. Also got into some of the theoretical frameworks that I was working under a professor at UC Santa Barbara named James Brooks, who did a lot of work on borderlands theory, and I saw it as applicable. We're essentially looking at how in certain settings where there's an absence of colonial authority, that oftentimes you see unique identities formed and flipping of these kind of colonial hierarchies in unique ways. And I saw that in the surf zone, that it was a space that was right adjacent to the land where you'd have very different identities that are formed. I'll illustrate this with one quick story. I took students to Waikiki. That's one cool thing about working in Hawaii. We did this as a project, and they were reading this book. And as we're at Waikiki, we're studying these folks called the Waikiki Beach Boys. These are Hawaiian men that, particularly, mostly men, but there's women as well that work in this industry. And they teach people how to surf, and they are revered as these very important people that are experts in the ocean, and they have this level of respect in the surf. So we were there, and one of my students was observing one of these individuals and saw how everyone respected him there in the water. Everybody knew him. He was clearly somebody of value and importance. She then saw him check out from his beach job where he's teaching surfing, walked across the street to a hotel, put on a valet jacket, and she said, instantly his roles flipped. People were telling him what to do. He didn't seem like he was important at all. And so that dynamic between the ocean and the land is something that's very palpable, and the beach is oftentimes a buffer of that. Some of the theoretical frameworks, post-colonial theory, cultural studies, borderland theory, other topics within masculinity were something that I taught. And I mentioned this previously about borderlands theory, and this quote here kind of identifies a little bit of that. The Po'inanalu, or the surf zone, is a place where resistance proved historically meaningful, and Hawaiian men regularly flipped colonial hierarchies and categories upside down. The significance of space when you're studying and representing and writing about other peoples and communities. On land, the quote here, many Hawaiians were marginalized from political, social, and economic spheres in much of the 20th century. In the ocean, native surfers secured a position on top of a social hierarchy. I mean, these are kind of redundant statements and are reiterating the point that I've already made, but space and understanding the space and the context of that space when you're studying it is very important. Primary sources were of course, vital to my work, as most historians' work is. Uniquely, though, in Hawaiian history, we have most of those stories that I write about in the early ancient time period were based on oral histories. But those oral histories were preserved in writing in the 1800s. That was a real fortunate thing in Hawaii, is that Hawaii became one of the most literate societies in the world in the 1800s. And a lot of that because of mandatory school, and also Hawaiians went through this shift from being an oral society to a literate society in a single generation. Now, there's pros and cons to that. The thing that they were worried about is when those folks who held all the knowledge within their minds, with the memorized oral chants and the histories, what happens in that transition when they pass and you don't have a generation that still does that. So, but fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, you had some folks who knew and predicted that, and so they went around all the countryside and interviewed as many people as possible, and they preserved those stories by writing them down in these Hawaiian language newspapers. And these newspapers, when I was writing my dissertation, became an incredible resource because they became digitized. You see how old I am now, but I first started using like the microfilm. Some of our historians remember this in the library with the dim screen and stuff. Anyway, once they digitized all these Hawaiian language newspapers, then you could run a search on things. I'll never forget the first day when there was this website called Ulukau that digitized newspapers, and I typed in the word he'enalu, which is surfing in Hawaiian. And there were like 1,000 hits that came up, and I was like, thank you! Sorry, I'm getting geeked out here. One thing that was very apparent in these stories, these histories that were oral and that became preserved, was that surfing was a deep tradition within Hawaiian society. There were many, many stories of Hawaiian surfers. Interestingly, majority of them about women, female surfers, which shows a really important dynamic within gender of roles of, you know, is it manly to surf? And historically, technically, you'd say no, it wasn't really gendered. You'd have a lot of stories of very empowered women in surfing, and a lot of great stories on them. Now, another thing that I had a beef with was people who are telling stories about Hawaiian surfing, because it didn't align with what I knew to be true, and so you have these contesting narratives. Actually, what I first started writing about was a group of surfers on the Oahu's North Shore known as the Hui o He'enalu. And these guys they formed in the 1970s, and they were also kind of seen as this kind of surfing thugs, who people had a kind of a negative stigma about, and that intrigued me, and I started to do some research on them, and started interviewing them, and I told their story. And there was much more to it than just them being thugs. I studied the relationship that they were having with this sense of preserving that space as that was being sort of colonized in sorts in the 1970s with professional surfing as an industry, and the influx of people coming to Hawaii and the North Shore to conquer it, and them feeling like they were being ignored, and as if they were invisible. And part of that has to do with the historical narratives that were being told. The idea that surfing was something that happened in ancient times in Hawaii, but eventually Hawaiians stopped doing it, and it's revived, and it becomes something that is transplanted from kings, from a sport of kings in the islands, that moves over as this noble thing that goes over to California, Australia, and elsewhere. And that is sort of a narrative that is pretty prevalent within a lot of the surf industry films and documentaries and so forth. And I feel like it's because of that narrative, this sense of who owns surfing, that created these tensions when they came to the North Shore. So when people were getting beat up on the North Shore in the surf zone, they were kind of like confused. Why are these guys so angry? And a lot of it had to do with just, and I'm not condoning what happened. It wasn't a good thing when there were incidents of violence. But they didn't really contextualize like this story of surfing being a bastion of culture, in opposition to the colonization that was taking place on land. And then you had somebody coming in, claiming that, taking it, bringing permits with them to hold surfing competitions that excluded everyone else. Said, hey, we have rights to this beach. You people need to move. And Hawaiians were like, so it contributed to some of this conflict. And it's also a reflection, this narrative of this conquest of even something as simple as surfing. It's a reflection of other versions of Hawaiian history. This oversimplification of conquest is something that was sort of natural, something that wasn't contested by the natives, something that was seamless, something that was desired. And so I'm going to show a quick video clip that articulates the way that surfing history, this video is part of a large movie that came out. Hopefully the audio works. Sorry, I didn't test this earlier. But this is from a surfing documentary film that articulates what I was saying about some of the things about the history that was a little unsettling to me. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward through some of this through the interest of time. It's just talking about the history of surfing, how it was an ancient sport, how kings did it, how Captain James Cook wrote in his journals when he came to Hawaii what it looked like. But the part I want to talk about, he talks about how the missionaries came and banned the sport, and then we're going to talk about
banned the sport. The extinct Polynesian pastime was then reintroduced in the early 20th century by Alexander Hume Ford, a globe-trotting promoter who set about reviving island tourism by romanticizing surfing at Waikiki. In 1912 came surfing's first international icon, Waikiki beach boy and celebrated Olympic swimming champion Duke Kahanamoku, the only surfer to ever appear on a U.S. stamp. While traveling the globe giving swimming demonstrations, Duke became surfing's Johnny Appleseed, introducing his favorite sport to far-flung places like California, New York, and Australia. One of the fans enthralled by the Duke was a young Wisconsin swimming champion named Tom Blake. Relocating to Hawaii, Blake would go on to become one of the 20th century's most influential surfers through his innovative surfboard design, but most importantly, through his advocacy of surfing as a way of life.
Now, I do like the movie, and I don't have problems with most of it. But there were a couple of really subtle things that were said in there. One of them was that surfing went extinct, and then it was revived by Alexander Hume Ford, who was a promoter that promoted surfing. But through my research, I found that this is blatantly not true. So although some have erroneously suggested that Hawaiian surfing slipped into near extinction, surfing has actually been an avenue for thriving Hawaiian culture for years. So this is an example of some of the Hawaiian language newspapers, what they look like, and just evidence after evidence after evidence of people, not only in Hawaiian, but in English papers. I mean, even Mark Twain came to Hawaii in 1860. He was dodging the Civil War. And while he was in Hawaii, he writes in his narratives, his stories about how he came and watched people surfing. He said that he tried it, and he said he failed miserably, and he said, I'll leave that to the natives. Many, many examples, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, presumably the time when surfing went extinct. And being from the town of Hilo, I was really intrigued with all the entries of people writing about surfing and watching it in Hilo during this time of so-called extinction. In Waves of Resistance, the book, this photograph, I used this photograph to argue that this wave was in Hilo, because part of the storyline is that, well, there were hardly any people surfing, maybe Duke Kahanamoku and one or two of his friends, but that was only in Waikiki, not like what it used to be throughout all the islands. I stuck my neck out on this photo, and I was like, no, this is not Waikiki, this is Hilo Bay. The archivist at the Bishop Museum disagreed with me until we found this photo, is another picture from the same roll. So this is the earliest photograph we have of surfing ever. It's in the 1890s, and this is shot number 1, and this is shot number 2 from a little bit of a different angle, and there's a landmark there in the back, and this is Hilo Bay. I even had some stunt doubles here. This is my son and my nephew, and just to show, like, you see that background there? That's where this is. It was fun to disprove people. So it is a place of refuge, a contested borderland, unique space where Hawaiian autonomy, I found, existed in unique ways. Freedom to defy colonial prescriptions about how Hawaiian men should behave. That's an interesting statement, but with colonial notions of masculinity and manhood, and with being a native at that time, there were certain prescriptions of how they were expected to behave. And even laws. For example, there were laws against miscegenation laws that prevented Native peoples and people of color from marrying, particularly women who were white. Shoot. Okay, I'll show another video clip here.
From the moment of first contact in the 18th century, the arriving Haoles, European explorers, merchantmen, and even missionaries were fascinated with Hawaii's wave riders, very obviously impressed by the islanders' passion for their favorite sport. It was a passion that against all odds endured. By the end of the next century, 100 years of contact with the outside world had wiped out almost all vestiges of the Hawaiian culture. All except one.
Essentially, Hawaii was taken illegally at the turn of the century. You have this group of guys, the Committee of Safety, who overthrow the Queen and said they were taking over.
It was a simple political coup. The United States participated in it because the Committee of Safety wanted political power and possibly annexation to the United States. And the kingdom didn't stand a chance.
Sugar was a big business in Hawaii, and the primary business guys, they saw it in their best interest for Hawaii to become part of the United States.
But on a deeper level, it wasn't just economics. A lot of these men believed that no country really could govern itself unless it had a high degree of Teutonic people in charge, Aryans, white people.
But what's fascinating is that the same key players who were involved with this overthrow of Hawaii's kingdom joined this surf club in Waikiki. And all of a sudden, this new club pops up, and in the front it says, "For whites only." And you have these same players who were involved with this overthrow that are now in this surf club, learning to surf and going out into the surf and going head to head with, in many ways, the same Hawaiians that were involved. But the outcome is actually quite different than what happened on land. In the end, these Hawaiian surfers assert themselves and remain on top, and they sort of maintain their space and their chiefly roles in the Hawaiian waves. And it's precisely because of this history of them resisting colonialism in the surf that you have unique identities and a sense of sovereignty, I think, and autonomy that accompanies these guys when they're in the wave. And that's what makes, I think, the surf zone a very unique thing. Surfing becomes a place where you could still be Hawaiian.
All right. Every time I watch that, I'm like, shucks, I look older now. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So I've been in a couple of documentaries, and anyway, just sort of have the narrators from these both became superheroes. So this was Thanos' voice, and then I did another one on Duke Hanamoku, and Aquaman is the narrator. So I like to feel like I'm I'm a superhero of sorts. All right, so I talked a little bit about overthrow. There's some important dates here. 1893, you have the overthrow of the Queen of Hawaii, who, by the way, later did join the church in 1906. Actually, my great-great-grandfather, there's a few of my cousins in the room, great-great-grandfather baptized the Queen. It was really cool. So I don't have time to get into this story. It's a very important story if you don't know it. But essentially, to sum this up, the reason why I say that it was illegal overthrow is because there was a process to overthrowing a country. It would have been done through a treaty. When anybody knows international, law, between two heads of states have to agree a treaty. And Hawaii also was recognized by the international community as an independent state, which was very unique. In fact, Hawaii, most people don't realize, was one of the first non-Western countries to gain that status. So they're recognized as being independent and a sovereign state, and also a neutral state. So, but the Spanish-American War breaks out 1898, and the United States has a vested interest in Asia. And it begins with a war in the Philippines, and Hawaii becomes the premier kind of spot. Today, it's still the Central Pacific Command. Pearl Harbor is for the entire U.S. Pacific Command Center. So it's anyway, but that it is important to understand that context, to understand what's going on in the ocean too, because in many ways it's a response to that, whether it's a lack of power on land or it's a response to the way that how protective these surfers are of that space, because it is a kind of an important space. The Waikiki Beach Boys are surfers in the early 1900s. Duke Hanamoku and others decided to create this business. It was a pretty lucrative business, actually. But as you can see, what they're doing here is they're surfing with white women and others, of course. In Hawaii, the tourism industry at that time was just burgeoning. There were no real we didn't have airplanes flying to Hawaii just yet. So you'd have these cruise liners that would come, and pretty much it was limited to people who could afford it, pretty wealthy folks. Oftentimes divorcees who were maybe outcast in the United States because it wasn't very socially acceptable would find themselves on vacation in Hawaii on a beach and getting a massage from a Hawaiian beach boy who would take them out surfing and entertain them and revitalize their life in the ocean. They became very popular. Many of them became celebrities, ran this business that was actually pretty lucrative. And were interacting, oftentimes getting married, in fact, with a lot of these women. And there was a sense of, as I mentioned earlier, defying colonial prescriptions of how they should behave. Duke Kahanamoku, of course, is an icon. He becomes an ambassador. He is an Olympian who wins gold medals for the United States as the world's fastest swimmer at that time. But as he went to all these different events and Olympic Games and also training in the United States, he brought surfing with him everywhere he went. So he's revered as the father of modern-day surfing. I'm going to skip this clip. This talks a little bit about tourism. I'll just use this quote instead. So, in the middle of the 1900s, the 20th century, there is as airplanes start flying to Hawaii, the tourism industry starts to grow in larger amounts. And this is Clyde Aikau. He's the brother of a gentleman named Eddie Aikau who passed away. Eddie Aikau in Hawaii is like a mythical creature. He's kind of iconic in the sense that he died trying to rescue, trying to save his crew members. He was on the canoe Hokulea, a double hull voyaging canoe. The canoe capsized. They had no radio, no escort boat. He had a surfboard on the canoe. He tried to paddle to the nearest island and was never found. But he was a legendary big wave surfer. He was a lifeguard that saved hundreds of people. And this is his brother. And his brother is talking about when him and his brother Eddie were growing up surfing. He says in 1960s, as kids walking on the beach, watching the luau's and the music, he says he had this real sense of feeling not wanted and feeling that sense of hurt. In that very same clip, he then goes into how in the ocean it was a different experience. And the language he uses is, but in the ocean was everything to us. Surfing made us feel like kings. So the contrast between those two senses is very intriguing to me. I mentioned briefly about this club. This is a picture of Eddie Aikau, who was also a member of the Hui o He'enalu, this Hawaiian surf club. And in 1976, they were formed to preserve a Hawaiian identity and influence in this time when professional surfing was converging on the north shore of Oahu. But the Hui o He'enalu is more than just these guys that surf and regulate surfing lineups and regulate competitions on the North Shore, but they also bring, cultural practice into the sport to reiterate and to emphasize the importance of Hawaiian identity. So there's an event called the Backdoor Shootout, which is a professional competition where they have these opening ceremonies that kind of celebrate the relationship between Hawaiian history, Hawaiian culture, and surfing. I'll show you a video clip of one of the protocols for the beginning of this event. All right, so just the bringing that cultural element into the competitive arena is a way of not only preserving identity, but also making a statement to others in the surfing world that surfing is a Hawaiian practice. I think that's a big rooted fear in a lot of Hawaiians, that they will be somehow marginalized from their very own sport and cultural practice. This is a young female surfer. Her name is Moana Jones Wong, and she's known as the Queen of Pipeline. This is the world's most dangerous wave. More people die at Pipeline than anywhere else in the world, hands down. And this is a quote from her. She says, "The Hui Backdoor Shootout," this event I was showing you, "always gets the best waves." And here's interesting, her assessment of why that is the case. 100%, the waves come to the Backdoor Shootout because of the mana of the event. So mana is a term that refers to kind of a spiritual, cultural energy that comes with administering proper protocol and being in a place where you're doing things pono or right. So today, contemporary Hawaiian surfers, they carry that kuleana, that stewardship in many ways of representing not only surfing, and they're trying to be a competitive athlete, but also this sense of being Hawaiian. And there's pros and cons to that. Ezekiel Lau here is one of Hawaii's best professional surfers, and he says, being Hawaiian means everything to me. I'm wearing that on my sleeve, like literally, I guess. It's in my blood, my roots. It's what I was born to do. I do know this young man, and I also see where there's sort of a weight of that. And I think that sort of is an added burden when competing because he feels like he's representing a nation. Carissa Moore has been very successful. She's a four-time women's world champion, arguably the best female surfer ever. And she's a native Hawaiian. She's also a gold medalist. She says here, surfing originated with my native Hawaiian ancestors, and I feel blessed to be able to carry this tradition on. I do it because it fills my soul, and that's why my ancestors did it. I feel most at home and at peace with myself in the ocean. I don't think, I just let it flow from my na'au, which is like your spiritual sense of origin. Something very intriguing, and this is something that I argue, is that because of all of these years of asserting a Hawaiian identity in the surfing community, the surfing world recognizes Hawaiians as an independent people, distinctive from the United States. So in competitive and social settings, Hawaiian surfers, teams, and organizations are always identified as Hawaiian, not American, which is actually not contingent upon race either, or your ethnic origin. So just this year, the world surfing champion, his name is John Florence. He grew up in Hawaii on the North Shore. He's not native Hawaiian, but he represents Hawaii. And when he won the world title this year, he threw a Hawaiian flag up, just like we're seeing Carissa Moore do here, and he represents Hawaii. And no other state does that. Like, there's no California representation, or the East Coast, or Florida, or whatever. The United States is separate from Hawaii in these events. I remember once watching this junior world title. This was a precursor to the Olympics, and they had these junior world championships. And this is an older one, but Team Hawaii has its own team, and they've won gold medal many, many times. But this is the first time that it was broadcast live on the internet, and I was at home watching. And I know that when you go up to the podium, your country is recognized by playing your national anthem. So there was a moment of pause here where I was like, what are they going to play? And they ended up playing Hawaii Pono'i, which is the traditional national anthem of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I was blown away by that, as if transported into an alternate dimension where the 19th century Hawaiian society leaped onto a different historical timeline years ago. And Hawaii surfers represent the nation of Hawaii on this world stage. So it was a really kind of interesting experience for me. Identity and history taught in surfing competitions. This is something I do for fun, and I'm very honored to do this. But in surfing, in the professional surfing industry, what happens with competition, it's unlike any other sport. In fact, most surfers argue, is surfing a sport or an art? We still haven't come to any conclusions on that. And mainly because the field itself moves, right? And the ocean chooses the surfer, because sometimes the ocean can go flat, and you have these long periods where no one's doing anything. So at the backdoor shootout, they invite me to come and to talk while there's no waves, and I've used that.
Rocky Cannon with Isaiah Walker, the doctor, giving us Aloha Sunday.
Sorry, it was a Sunday.
Knowledge. So good, bro.
Right on. Yeah. Aloha Sunday, Hawaiian History Day. So, by the end of the cast, we'll have some sort of certificate for our viewers. We'll pass out a final exam to everyone, see if they can remember.
Because now you can, remote classes. You guys can tune in online. And if you guys taking notes at home, get honorary certificates.
Oh, my goodness. Look at this
Wow.
one from way back.
Team Quicksilver.
That looks like Reef Macintosh.
I believe so.
So it's fun doing this, and I've taken it upon myself to educate people on Hawaiian history. I'll show you a couple examples. Hopefully I'm not being too promoting here.
This event is dedicated to Duke Kahanamoku,
Mm-hmm.
and Duke Kahanamoku was born in 1890.
Okay.
And so, he lived during that time of the Kingdom of Hawaii, through the provisional government when they overthrew the Queen of Hawaii. Now, that happened on January 17th, 1893. So January 17th, coming up really soon here,
Yeah, in 2 days.
commemorates the 130 years since the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. But as I was mentioning, as I was talking with Ezra, there's two dates that are important. 1893 was that coup that took place. 1898 is the annexation. So really there's that period where it's kind of in limbo, or like, because the 1893 coup wasn't sanctioned, and it wasn't, there was no treaty that took place. There was a lot of uncertainty, and there were several attempts to try and restore the Queen back to power. One of those attempts was led by the Hawaiian surfer and Prince Jonah Kuhio.
Jonah Kuhio, sorry, cut out early. So it's kind of fun, but it's also, I think, maybe something to can inspire you that when we're doing history and we're doing scholarship, you can think of your audience, right? And so, you know, a lot of my work appeals to an academic audience, but it's also fun to appeal to a general audience. And through the feedback is mixed. Most people say, I love learning the Hawaiian history. I'm feeling it. I'm learning a lot. To some other comments, I feel like I'm back in school. Dr. Walker is putting me to sleep. I saw some of you sleeping here today, too. So, well, really what it is, too, it's directing the narrative, right? And I talked about before, when initially I entered into this project, that there were things about the way people were telling the stories and representing these voices of these people, of Native Hawaiians, that didn't sit right with me through my personal experience, my lived experience, my family experience. And so I took it upon myself to help to change that narrative. So as scholars, we have the opportunity to direct narrative with legitimate scholarship. We can correct misconceptions, debunk myths, and produce thoughtful analysis and critique. The quality of surfing scholarship has really improved over the last few decades, and a lot of that is because of conversations we're having. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, who I think I failed to mention is the academic vice president of BYU Hawaii as well, as being a professor of history. We have time for a couple of questions. We do need to move out because they've got another event coming in at 3, but if you have a question, you can, we have a microphone here, and Dr. Walker can take a couple of questions. So raise your hand, tell us your name, what you're studying, and ask your question.
Hey, the last group stayed here late, so we can, well, we'll go right up to.
You probably know the direct quote from Liliuokalani, that she believed the American people would do justice to the Hawaiian people.
Well, yeah, so all right, so Queen Liliuokalani wrote a book called My Story, the Queen's Story. And a lot of times people have taken things out of context. For example, she surrenders to the United States in 1893, but she doesn't. Most people have misinterpreted that. She said she temporarily surrenders her executive authority to the United States government, until which time they would restore it again. She was placing her faith in the American government because it wasn't the United States that had overthrown her. It were citizens of the United States who had done this. She was very close to the president of the United States at the time, was Grover Cleveland. And he came out and verbally condemned the overthrow in 1893. And so she had trust that the United States would legally do what they were supposed to do, which was restore the Queen back to power. And when they didn't, that was devastating. Because they were breaking their own law. Essentially, the way Hawaii was annexed, there was a treaty attempt. It didn't pass in Congress. So, out of desperation, they annexed Hawaii. Was called a Joint Resolution Bill, which is essentially if Congress were to decide without asking, for example, Canada, if just 50% of our legislators in Washington, D.C. decided, yeah, we should have Canada. It should be good for them. That's essentially what happened. Right? So, yeah, she did have trust in the United States, but I think we misunderstand what that means.
But the plan is like gold, that maybe figurehead. She can be the queen, but just a figurehead.
Gotcha. Yeah. There's a very complex history of her relationship with Dole and stuff. And that's what I like about the story of the surfing. Those same individuals, their names appear in these stories as well. But yeah, thank you. Okay, other questions? Hi, aloha.
Hi, aloha. My name is Angela. I'm a proud alumna of BYUH,
Yay!
BYU Hawaii, and currently taking my master's in public administration here. My question is, what would it take for Hawaii to be an independent state again?
Yeah, good one. Something that's really cool that I've witnessed in my, I guess I'm getting old. I'm 51, but I've seen even within my academic career, when I first, as a graduate student, studied Hawaiian issues and issues of independence and so forth, it went from being pretty raw and unrefined to today it's much more sophisticated. I mean, it used to be people trying to break into the palace and proclaim themselves king or queen or whatever, to now it's like much more sophisticated. And we have a lot more PhDs working in the area of international law, particularly. And they're really focused on this concept of this point of that, okay, well, if the United States, if there was no treaty, and if we were an independent state, is that independent state, does it still exist? And technically and legally, the answer is yes, because there was no undoing of that status of their independence and of their political status that was recognized. I mean, treaties from the United States, from Great Britain, from France, Germany, all the world powers, we have treaties with them where they recognize Hawaii's independence. So, but as far as practically is concerned, that's a different question. Just because something isn't legally right doesn't mean it still doesn't happen, right? I mean, the Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954, and in 1963, Martin Luther King was still having a dream that segregation would end, even though it already technically did legally. So by practice, it's a little different than theory.
Did you know that when the United States wrote the Articles of Confederation, they did it with the knowledge about the states? They said, hey, we will join the Union as long as we can get out if we want. That Virginia did have it in their constitution at the time. I think that's interesting to note. And I guess the effects of the Civil War really affected that because it sort of created that idea that once you join the Union, you can never get out. So I think that's interesting. You have to be like undo certain things that the Civil War kind of created. But I think that's just my opinion. So.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay.
I think we have time for one more question.
There's a hand. Oh, sorry.
I know that Hawaii right now is having a lot of issues with the price of land and a lot of native peoples being pushed out. How do you see surfing playing a role in preserving native culture still as land prices rise? And what do you want to see for the future of Hawaii?
Thank you. Yeah, so inflation affects all of us, but more so in Hawaii because we have a finite resource in land as islands. I mean, as I mentioned, that surfing is in many ways an outlet for that, but that still is pushing people away. So, for example, I grew up in Hilo in the 1980s, and we lived on the beach, or at least near the beach, and most of my neighbors were local families that also lived near the beach. Today, to live near the beach is nearly impossible unless you are renting it out to tourists as an Airbnb. Most homes on the beach today are now vacation rentals, and it's destroying that accessibility to the ocean culturally for young people. For many years, I ran a surf club for kids to just help provide that access, to teach them to surf and to get them to the ocean, to still have that connection. It's also health related. Native Hawaiians have terrible health statistics unless they're ocean people. If you're connected to the ocean, it's a very different health experience that you have. So there's a lot to that. And I don't have the answers. I would love to say, well, the land just got cheaper. Actually, technically, the real problem was when in the 1850s when we privatized land. The problem wasn't the privatization of land. It was making it alienable where foreigners could purchase it. Most Pacific islands today isn't like that. You go to the Cook Islands or Samoa or other places, You have to be a resident of that place to own land. You can lease land and rent land. Kind of wish Hawaii did that.
All right, let's give a big mahalo and a round of applause to